Have you ever thought about how different ways of reading ancient texts like scriptures could actually steer a whole community's path, sometimes even towards really tough historical outcomes? Today, we're going to take a deep dive into exactly that, exploring how these interpretations, these deep ideas about faith, had very real, very concrete effects on history.
It's absolutely fascinating stuff. And the sources we've looked at really bear this out, showing how biblical interpretation in ancient Israel wasn't just academic, it had profound consequences.
Yeah, it's about how these maybe seemingly abstract ideas played out on the ground historically.
Exactly. It's the link between belief and actual lived history.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission here, for you, is to pull out the key insights from these sources. We're focusing on ancient Israel, and the writings seem to highlight two sort of main ways of interpreting things.
That's right. Two main streams.
First, there's what we might call a Deuteronomy-centric approach. This one really emphasized things like education, justice, living righteously. That was seen as central to their covenant.
Their special agreement with God, yeah.
And then the second stream.
Well, alongside that, there was also an approach more focused on Exodus and Leviticus. Think more about the detailed temple rituals, the sacrificial system, the priesthood's roles, all those ceremonial practices.
Ah, okay. So more outward focus, perhaps.
More centered on the temple and specific acts of worship, definitely. And this sets up a really interesting question, doesn't it?
Which is?
What actually happened when the community's focus shifted between these two? Between, say, living justly and performing rituals? Because, as the sources show, the consequences weren't just spiritual.
They affected everything. Their survival, their identity.
Precisely.
And what's really quite surprising looking at the material is how early this tension seems to appear. The texts point to Moses himself, right, preparing the Israelites before they even enter Canaan.
Yeah, introducing Deuteronomy. It was presented as sort of a blueprint for practical living in this new land they were heading towards.
And it kind of challenges that common picture we have, doesn't it, of early Israel just conquering Canaan.
It really does. The interpretation suggests that instead of widespread massacre, their initial approach, guided by those Deuteronomic values, was actually an attempt at coexistence.
Coexistence.
Yeah.
With the Canaanites already there.
Yes. They were immigrants, a minority group trying to live out their covenant, maintain their identity, but also potentially influence their neighbors positively, all based on that idea of shared justice from Deuteronomy.
Okay, so that's the early picture. But then things changed.
They did. As you move into the eras of King David and especially King Solomon, the sources highlight a pretty major shift.
Right. The temple gets built in Jerusalem. That must have been huge.
Monumental. And with it came this real ramp up in emphasis on those complex ritual-heavy sacrifices we mentioned. The Exodus-Leviticus model really came to the fore.
And you might think, well, okay, that's just upper religious devotion.
You might. But the sources dig deeper. They suggest that behind this religious shift, there were often strong political currents running.
Politics? Like what?
Well, consolidating royal power, for one. Establishing a hereditary monarchy, making it secure. Solomon's famous wealth, for instance, it's actually critiqued quite sharply in these texts.
How so?
As being built partly on, well, exploiting the ordinary people, which starts to rub up against those Deuteronomic ideals, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So, okay, you've got this outward show of piety, the temple, the sacrifices.
Yeah.
But underneath, something else is going on. Is that what you're saying the sources identify? A disconnect.
Yes, a crucial disconnect. While the focus was on the rituals, the core values emphasized back in Deuteronomy were being compromised.
Compromised how? Can you give an example?
Sure. The texts talk about things like land inheritance laws, which were meant to protect families, being ignored, or the courts showing clear favoritism towards the rich and powerful.
Okay, so that directly hits those Deuteronomic principles about justice and caring for the vulnerable.
Exactly. The widows, the orphans, the sojourner, the very people Deuteronomy highlighted for protection were being neglected. The essence of the covenant relationship was, you could say, eroding from within, even while the external worship looked impressive.
And this is where the prophets come in, isn't it? They weren't exactly quiet about that.
Not at all. They were incredibly vocal. They directly criticized the focus on extravagant temple rituals. They basically said, look, these fancy ceremonies, they're meaningless, even offensive to God if you're ignoring justice.
So they saw it as a violation of the covenant itself.
Absolutely. They argued that true covenant faithfulness wasn't about elaborate sacrifices. It was about enacting justice, especially for the marginalized. That was the real worship.
A faith lived out day to day, not just in, special buildings or ceremonies.
Precisely. And they didn't mince words. They issued these stark warnings. If the people kept abandoning the core of the covenant, focusing only on the external stuff, judgment would come.
What kind of judgment?
National destruction, exile. They saw a direct link, a historical cause and effect. Live by the covenant, you survive and thrive. Abandon it, you face the consequences. It wasn't just fortune telling, it was a kind of historical and theological analysis.
And tragically, those warnings, they came true, didn't they?
They did. Israel, the northern kingdom, and later Judah, the southern kingdom, were eventually destroyed. The people were taken into exile in Babylon, a really devastating period.
So it's utterly bleak.
But, and this is where the sources reveal something quite powerful, quite paradoxical, even in the midst of that exile, that despair, something remarkable started to happen.
What was that?
That Deuteronomic faith, one focused on covenant living, justice, education, the one that had been largely sidelined, it started to experience a revival, a restoration.
Exile. Without the temple, without the priesthood, the land.
Well, that's the key. With the central temple gone, a new kind of community focus emerged. The synagogue. And within these synagogues, there was this incredible flourishing of legal education.
Education. Not rituals.
Education. Teachers, rabbis, not priests, became central. The sources paint this picture, people working hard all day under Babylonian rule, and then gathering at night, not for elaborate ceremonies, but to study. To learn and memorize the law, the covenant texts.
Wow. After a long day's work, they're hitting the books, essentially, studying law.
Intensely. It's quite something when you think about it. It suggests this deep searching, trying to understand why this had happened to them, and finding the answers back in the covenant itself. They found hope there.
That level of dedication is, well, it's pretty humbling.
It really is. The texts mention their passion for education was so strong, some people could apparently recite the entire Pentateuch, the first 5 books, including Deuteronomy and Exodus, completely from memory.
The whole thing. Goodness.
They were embedding it, re-embedding the covenant into their daily lives, teaching it constantly, even, the texts say, to unborn children. It was a total community effort to re-embody those core principles.
So they're rediscovering the Deuteronomic core in exile. And did this connect back to the prophets' warnings?
It did. Some prophets, like Jeremiah, started to reinterpret the exile itself. It wasn't just punishment. It was seen as potentially a path towards the destruction of their oppressor, Babylon.
How could their exile lead to Babylon's fall?
The idea was, if Israel genuinely returned to the covenant, if they restored that relationship properly, then Babylon, which had been the instrument of God's judgment, would effectively lose its purpose. Its reason for existing in that role would disappear, and it would fall.
That's a pretty bold interpretation.
Very. But then the sources point to what happened next as astonishing proof.
Which was?
King Cyrus of Persia arrives on the scene, conquers Babylon, seemingly out of nowhere, and then does something remarkable. He lets the Jewish exiles go home.
Right, the famous Edict of Cyrus.
Exactly. And the sources don't just portray this as good luck or smart politics. They frame it as the direct fulfillment of that prophetic interpretation.
You mean because the exiles had returned to the covenant?
Babylon, the tool of judgment, crumbled, just as predicted. It was seen as undeniable proof that their faithfulness, their return to those core Deuteronomic values, had real-world historical consequences.
Okay, so pulling all this together, what's the big takeaway here from this deep dive? What do the sources ultimately point to?
Well, I think it's incredibly clear how they understood their core covenant and, crucially, how they lived it out in practice. That was the decisive factor. It literally shaped their destiny as individuals and as a whole community.
So it wasn't just about having the right ideas or even doing the rituals.
No, not according to this interpretation. The texts really hammer home that what mattered was the substance of the covenant, especially things like justice, social responsibility, education actually being put into practice, not just surface level stuff.
Not just going through the motions.
Precisely. It was about the lived reality of those core values. That seems to be the recurring lesson the history offered them and perhaps offers us.
And even though this is ancient history, looking at how these interpretative choices, these shifts in focus, led to such dramatic outcomes, it really does give us something to think about today, doesn't it?
It really does.
It raises that question for you, listening now. Thinking about these historical examples, is there a risk, maybe, that our own communities, our societies today, could fall into a similar trap?
Focusing too much on the visible. on achievements or maybe fleeting emotions or just formalities.
Yeah, and in doing that, perhaps neglecting those fundamental values, things like social responsibility, justice, the stuff that really holds things together.
It's a powerful mirror, isn't it? This ancient deep dive really can serve to help us spot potential blind spots in our own time.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How a conscious reevaluation of our own core values, prompted by looking back at history like this, might actually shape a very different collective future for all of us. Something to reflect on.